Assalamu alaikum, I'm Carl Arrindell and you're watching In Focus. Now my guest today will be a familiar face to most of our viewers. Mosen Beg is one of 9 British citizens who were held at Camp X-Ray Guantanamo Bay by the government of the United States of America. Mosen was labelled an enemy combatant by the US government. The US authorities later admitted was without foundation and the precise nature of which has never been determined. 2 years of the time spent in Guantanamo was in an 8 by 6 foot solitary confinement cell. Following his release, Moazzam authored an award-winning book, Enemy Combatant, detailing life as a Muslim living in the UK and his experiences in Guantanamo. It was the first book to be published by a former Guantanamo Bay prisoner and has been translated into several languages. Moazzam is the founder and director for the prison human rights organisation Cage Prisoners, now known as Cage, and has since become one of the most authoritative voices against the war on terror. Last February, Mosen Beg was arrested in the UK, charged with providing terrorist training and funding terrorism overseas. After spending 6 months in the high-security Belmarsh prison, the case against him was spectacularly collapsed in October this year after secret intelligence material was handed to prosecutors at the opening of the trial. Assalamu alaikum, Moazzam, and welcome to Islam Channel.
Wa alaikum salam.
Now, last month you were released from Belmarsh prison when the case against you of participating in terrorist activities in Syria spectacularly collapsed in the Birmingham hearing. Now, that followed your arrest in February and a 8-month, I think, incarceration. Now, on your release, you were reported as saying that, and I quote, "I need to understand what it is like to be a free man, and I think that it's important to point out some of the government's failures in its foreign policy and internal policies. It's clear demonising of the Muslim community." Now, it's a known fact that since your release from Guantanamo, you've been a high-profile critic of the government's complicity in torture and their questionable foreign policy involvement. Were you suggesting in that statement that when you were arrested, you were locked up in a high-security prison because of your activities of lobbying the government? And is this an example of the wider harassment and demonisation of the Muslim community?
Well, I think that it's unquestionable the fact that the government has been, since my release from Guantanamo, they took my passport away the first time. They have made sure that when I did get my passport back, that every time I travelled, every single time I travelled, even if I was travelling to the European Parliament to speak there, I was being stopped under Schedule 7 of the Terrorism Act. In addition to that, again, my passport was taken in the end of 2013, almost a year after I'd gone to Syria. My visits to Syria I've written about, I've spoken about. I met once with the intelligence services explaining that I'm going to Syria to investigate them, and they, in the presence of our lawyers and their lawyers, said that they wouldn't prevent me. So I was always very open. So the only conclusion I can come to is that the reason why the constant harassment has happened is because I've been uncovering in country after country where the Arab revolutions happened and elsewhere, that the British government has been complicit in torture. And in the last place I discovered this was that they had, in at least one case, done intelligence cooperation before the Arab Spring with the Assad regime in the rendition of a victim.
So are you saying that you firmly believe that this wasn't just a default of the new laws introduced and the fact that you hadn't necessarily filled in the right forms on this occasion, but a systematic and very calculated intention to put you behind bars?
Well, absolutely, but also because the British government has had a very confused policy on Syria. And I'll give you an example. As late as November 2013, I was going on a trip to Turkey, and they stopped me at the airport, Birmingham airport, and said, "We think you might be going to Syria." And I said, "Well, I've been there, done that. And if I wanted to go, I'd tell you straight." They delayed me, so I missed the flight. But then they said, and here's the crunch, is that we'll book you onto the next flight. But I said I might be going to Syria. And more importantly, would you as the British police be willing to facilitate my travel to Syria? So this shows what sort of a confused policy there has been right from the get-go.
Now, I know that you arrived here today at the office straight from Belmarsh. My first thought was that you might have become institutionalised, but I gather you were just picking up some of your possessions. Now, how did the incarceration in Belmarsh impact on both you and your family? I mean, I know you'd spent 3 years at the behest of the US authorities in Guantanamo and elsewhere. How did it impact you? Were you shocked by the arrest and then incarceration? Were you angry? And how did it, were you frightened? I mean, and how did it impact on your family?
Well, in a sense, that fateful morning when they came in February to my house, I was told that over 150 officers were involved in the entire investigation. I don't know how many came, but they filled the house, and I have a big house. So yes, it was frightening, but it wasn't unexpected because they'd taken my passport away a couple of months before and said that we believe you're involved in terrorism in Syria, and that's why you're taking it away. That's why we're taking it away. So I was always on edge that something may happen. But when they took, after 4 days of questioning, and I realized what sort of questions they're asking me, I understood they really don't know what they're doing. None of the police officers, none of the guards that held me ever felt that I was a terrorist threat. They used to make a joke of it. But when I was taken to Belmarsh and placed as a Category A prisoner, I mean, this is the most dangerous prisoners in the prison. Just to give you an example, in my spur, there were only 2 Category A prisoners out of 80. The other one was somebody who killed a police officer and me. So this is the length that the government has gone to try to suggest that we are so dangerous. And yet, again, just as President Bush had said, we had the worst of the worst, and yet I'm free. And so are 600 others from Guantanamo. I was the most dangerous prisoner a couple of months ago. Now I'm free. What sense is our government trying to suggest it's acting upon? Because it doesn't seem like it has any.
So, Mosen, what were you doing in Syria? What was the justification that at least was given by the security services for your arrest and trial? How was it that it took MI5 6 months to come forward to confirm your version of events? And will you be pursuing civil proceedings in this regard, as has been reported in the press?
Well, I went to Syria twice. On the first occasion, it was to pursue what I'd begun in Libya, and that was when I'd met the rebels who'd been involved in storming the headquarters of the Mukhabarat, the intelligence services of Gaddafi. They'd uncovered documents that showed that the British government was colluding with and working with the Gaddafi regime and the intelligence service. So from there, I found a strand that showed that the British government had cooperated also with the Assad regime, and I'd met the individual who'd been affected by that. So that's what took me initially into Syria. No doubt, like anybody else, I was affected by what I saw of the atrocities and the torture and the camps where people had to live. So on the second occasion, when I did go to continue my investigations, which again MI5 knew about because they wanted to talk about this, and so this time around, when I met numerous people there, and there were foreigners there, and there were Britons there, and there were people from the Arab world, and the local Syrians, of course, I found that several of them had, on the one hand, they'd been protesters, and then now they're having to fight one of the most brutal regimes in the region. So they were fighting, but not knowing how to do that, and often you'd hear that some of them had shot their own people, their own comrades, in the back of the head, or had allowed somebody to bleed to death because they didn't know how to apply basic triage. So I got together several former soldiers, former doctors and medics, and put them together to help to bring a program where they could help to teach some of the locals basic skills to defend themselves and defend the population. So I wasn't training them, but I brought them together. And this was this was the evidence that the government wanted to present as me being a trainer or a supporter of terrorists. The other charge that I had, so the first charge was that I was training terrorists. The second charge was that I provided a generator to one of the rebels for the purposes of terrorism.
Now, let's get this in perspective. This all took place at a time when the rhetoric, at least coming from the UK government, was that the Assad regime needed to be removed and that there were a cooperation with a coalition going on in Syria. Is that correct?
Well, look, I was there from October 2012 until around March 2013. So during this period, a few things didn't happen. ISIS didn't exist. The Al-Nusra Front wasn't proscribed. In fact, British foreign policy up until January 2014 had them supplying non-lethal aid to the Free Syrian Army up until that point. Now this non-lethal aid included, ironically, generators. It included bulletproof armor, and it included night vision goggles and so forth. But crucially, the Free Syrian Army, which was led at that time by a guy called Riyad al-Assad, he and many other of the leaders said that we believe that the al-Nusra Front are our brothers, and outlawing them was a mistake. And we fight alongside them, and we are all Jabhat al-Nusra. So that was what was happening, and the British government was supporting the Free Syrian Army at that time.
Now, you've recently expressed your deeply held belief that the government strategy in respect to the so-called returning jihadi fighters is flawed. Now, crucially, you said that the treatment of such individuals as posing an imminent threat to UK security and the harsh measures being implemented in this regard are misplaced.
Well, there are numerous lessons from your question, and the first one, of course, is the issue regarding the threat. We've got the government saying that the threat has been ratcheted up because of what's happened with ISIS and the tit-for-tat measures with Britain and America bombing and then beheading. But prior to that, it wasn't the case, at least that there wasn't this, because ISIS didn't exist in that way. What you've got is that the arrests that have happened, including mine, is a key statement by the police every single time. There is no imminent threat to the British public. It's almost as if this is by default, the police say this every time. But then what does it mean? The police are saying there's a threat, the police are saying there's no threat, the government is saying there is a threat. Who's right? The second point is that the people that I did meet in prison, the returning fighters, here's the most important point. The returning fighters, not the ones going out and joining ISIS. The returning. Why are they returning? Well, if we study, and you know, from my own research talking to them, was that they didn't want to be involved in the infighting between the groups. They'd gone out for benign reasons. They'd gone out to fight the Assad regime. They felt it was the right thing to do, that the government had this position at that time. They saw that it's now become a civil war between the rebel factions, and they didn't want to be part of it. And therefore they came back, and the British government, instead of welcoming them or at least rehabilitating them, imprisoned them. Now, the key factor here is that when you imprison somebody and nobody's really sure, the purposes of the terrorism law was to protect the British public. This is now protecting the Assad regime at best. So now what's going to happen with these young men? Are they going to come out of Belmarsh after serving 10 years or 15 years or however many years they're given of their young lives and think that Britain is a home that welcomed them? Or will they remember for the rest of their lives how Britain destroyed their youth?
Now, not many people were surprised to hear that you had offered to use your influence in a bid to secure the release of Alan Henning, the British humanitarian worker who was subsequently brutally beheaded by ISIS militants, and that this offer was ignored by both the UK Foreign Office and the intelligence services. You compared the response by other nations, such as Turkey, and suggested that Britain's policy had been, and I'm quoting it, to abandon its citizens, to let them die in order to be seen as adopting a tough stance. Do you still believe that this represents the abandonment of UK citizens, and why, in your opinion, is that strategy misguided?
Well, because I was told about Alan Henning well before anybody ever heard of him, and this was back in December 2013 when he was first taken to custody. I went with my lawyer to speak to a former British Foreign Office minister, and we discussed. I didn't need their help. They weren't going to help me to do anything in this world. But I was simply registering with them that I need to make contacts with people who are connected to ISIS because they're the ones who are holding him. And don't get me wrong if I'm trying to do that. I'm doing it only to try to secure the release of this man. I wrote a letter to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi in the language that he would have understood, in English and in Arabic, and that was on my hard drive, the same one that the police took away and kept in their custody alongside the picture, that iconic picture of Alan with a baby. And they sat on it for the next 8 months. The Foreign Office sat on it for the next 8 months. From inside prison, when I saw the first execution of the Americans, I realized that Alan Henning must still be alive. So I asked my lawyers to write to the Foreign Office yet again and say, please let me make a video recorded message like Abu Qatada had done before from in prison and managed to save several hostages in Iraq. And I could do it using the language of Guantanamo, the commonality of us being dressed in suits, orange suits, being threatened with execution, being a prisoner here in Belmarsh, accused of supporting Mujahideen in Syria, would resonate with Baghdadi, and he would have had to make some kind of a response because it would have called to that constituency. So the Foreign Office responded, but only 3 weeks after we wrote the letter, and only on the day and after the Alan Henning's name had become public. They came along and I explained to them what I wanted to do. They refused to allow me to do a recorded message, but they took a written message from me, which we'd prepared in Arabic and English, which somehow they said they were going to send through private channels and then sign it in my name. And I don't know how they could forge my signature and then somehow think it's going to be a credible message to ISIS. But this is why I say that the British government not only sat upon all of this, they didn't do anywhere near what could have been done and how it was done in the past. As again, when I say Abu Qatada saved the lives of other hostages before in the past in Iraq by making similar video messages.
So do you firmly believe that the British government's actions in many ways prevented the successful release of Annie Henning?
I think they killed any chance, any opportunity, the opportunity that could have availed itself from me making a message from inside prison was squandered. And I believe the reason why they did that is that they didn't want to be further embarrassed by my case.
Now, later this month, the UK Parliament will debate the new so-called fast-track counter-terrorism bill. The bill includes proposals like seizing passports of UK nationals suspected of travelling abroad to fight for terror groups, including the Islamic State. They'll be cancelled or confiscated. Border guards, airport police will be given powers to seize these passports. Individuals who try to leave the country again could have their passport withdrawn and be placed on no-fly lists, and there's threats of those who try to return after they've been banned from entry for 2 years, being imprisoned for up to 5 years if they try to sneak back in the country. Is this an example of the government using a hammer perhaps to crack a nut?
Well, I wrote an article before I was in prison. It was called Syria, Britain's New War on Terror, and in that I mentioned about how out of the, I think, 36 odd cases at the time, 35 people who'd had their nationalities revoked were Muslims. Clearly, we can see that the response of the government have been so unprecedented that it didn't do this when at the height of when Britain was being bombed, when the July the 7th attacks happened. The threat level, the country was in shock, but not to this level. You never heard about people being having their passports and nationalities removed and not even being allowed to come back into the country, which are the proposals now, the extension or the reintroduction of control orders, which have already deemed to be illegal in some aspects of it. So yes, the response has been unbelievably harsh. The numbers of people we have in prison right now connected to Syria far overshadows anything that happened at the time of the July the 7th bombings.
And Lord Ashdown very recently wrote an article suggesting that the terror threat hardly compares to that posed by the IRA during the 70s and 80s.
Well, of course, I mean, this is something, you know, 3,000 people died in that conflict. The IRA bombed right across the UK and Northern Ireland and the north of Ireland. But we didn't have these kind of measures. Now, it's important to remember that those measures came along. We had diplock courts and we had the BBC banning the voice of Gerry Adams and so forth. And in the end, they had to negotiate with him and so forth. But we're at this stage here where all of that, it's as if it never happened. And what we have now, every time, we're even saying now that Al-Qaeda is almost acceptable because ISIS is this, the terrorists always get worse every single time. And it suggests that the threat to the British public, who don't know any better, is much worse than it really is. The truth of the matter, it isn't. The majority of the people that have gone and come back to the UK were never with ISIS to begin with.
So is Charles Farr, I mean, he's the head of security services at the Home Office, was he wrong to say that the threat of the returning jihadis is the gravest threat to face Britain's security in the last 10 years? Is that an over-exaggeration?
It absolutely is, because the proof is in the pudding, as I said before. Every single time there's been a Syria-related arrest, almost every time at least, the police quote, there was no imminent threat to the British public. Now, when they say that, that's pretty much voided everything that Mr. Farr.
So what do you consider to be the explanation for this rather harsh response to the non-serious threat?
Well, look, let's remember what's happening in Syria. This is all to do with Syria, and it's nothing to do with Britain, to be honest with you. Neither Jabhat al-Nusra, which is Al-Qaeda's representative in Syria, or ISIS, prior to the attacks, to the airstrikes, had expressed any hostility directly towards Britain. In fact, I've seen numerous interviews with people from the al-Nusra Front who said we have no designs on attacking the West in any way. But there's an insistence. And now what's happened with the British and the Americans bombing, they've bombed not just ISIS, they've bombed the al-Nusra Front, and they've bombed Ahrar al-Sham, which is part of the Islamic Front, which is the largest coherent rebel group in the entire country. Now, if that's been their attitude towards all of these so-called Islamist groups, then it suggests only one thing. Either it's like a bull in a china shop and they don't know what they're doing, or they're doing it on purpose. And all that this is doing is driving those groups, because nobody fought ISIS harder than the al-Nusra Front and Ahrar al-Sham and the local groups. Well before, their members were being beheaded well before any Western hostages were beheaded. But the West was quite happy to see that happening. Now what they've done in striking these targets from all of the different groups, which they don't differentiate from, will drive everybody into the hands of ISIS and make them stronger.
What would you advise British nationals who may be considering travelling out to Syria or Iraq to join what are now prescribed ISIS or the al-Nusra fighters?
Britons who have gone over to fight in Syria, all of them are not with ISIS. It's really key and important to understand this. All of them are not with ISIS by any means at all. Look at the Degayas brothers, for example, the two who got killed and the one who's still there. They have been with a group that's been fighting ISIS. Now, they're the al-Nusra Front, but let's remember, let's not get everything confused. If this was about ISIS, then keep it about ISIS. But if it's about everybody, a young man from Derry in Northern Ireland, a convert to Islam, went over to fight with the Islamic Front. He was asked while he was out there, who are you with? He said, I'm with a group that's fighting against ISIS. Don't worry, I'm not in the wrong camp. When he came back to Northern Ireland, he's arrested under terrorism. So what this suggests is this is not about ISIS anymore. It's about any Muslim who goes over to a conflict zone and has been involved in anything that is against British foreign policy. Because what we've got also is we've got young men going over to join the PKK and to join the Peshmerga and to fight against ISIS. You can guarantee and rest assured that when they come back, they won't be prosecuted. So again, this is British foreign policy. Perhaps we need to look at countries like Sweden, where people can come and go, and as long as there's no threat to Sweden, and in the real terms of terrorism, they're still coming and going and nobody's being prosecuted. In Denmark, they have this process whereby returnees are helped to be rehabilitated with the community, with police supervision, but not with the prosecution service and not with being targeted by the government. And it seems to be working. I know people that are still out there. I know some humanitarian aid workers who are still there, living there with their families, helping to build refugee centres and so forth. I knew doctors there. I knew one doctor who got killed out there. And the work that these people have been doing is life-saving. Now, if you go to some regions where you see British ambulances, you see British fire trucks, British dump trucks, British vehicles, and that's the pride of what the British community, British Muslim community, has sent over there. So we've been connected to Syria, very much so, from the smallest towns to the larger towns, the larger cities. So nobody can ever tell us as a community, don't help, because
that's humanitarian aid, and of course, the British government is sending humanitarian aid. What about those who want to take up arms and to fight a battle of resistance or attacking ISIS or whatever?
There was a point where I certainly believed that it was illegal, that it was legal, that it wasn't illegal to go. And now the government has shown that clearly it is. It's confused because I know many people went over to Libya to fight and fought with Islamic groups and came back and they're fine, they never got prosecuted. So it's difficult to know what the government's criteria is, but what we do know is that if you're a Muslim and if you're perceived to have gone to fight anywhere with any group, perhaps maybe if you went with the Assad regime, perhaps you'd be spared a prosecution. But otherwise, if you're with the opposition in any of the opposition camps, then I think you will be prosecuted.
So on that note, are you saying it is totally unwise and not sensible for people to go there?
It's not sensible now because, well, if you want to go there and return and think that Britain's going to welcome you, it's not. It's going to try to imprison you. But there are people who are going to go regardless. There are people who are going to say, I don't care what the government thinks. I want to go and help the Syrians. Now, if somebody wants to go and help ISIS, that's a different matter because that requires, that's something totally different because ISIS has been involved in changing the entire direction of the Syrian revolution.
In the last few days, I've read that the Majesty's Treasury has lifted the terrorist asset freezing restrictions against you. Now, are such measures deployed in the absence of any judicial process? And can you perhaps explain for our viewers the significance of the freezing in terms of its impact on you and your family?
It's rather confusing because they did this about a week or two after I was in prison. So I received this notification of a terrorist asset freeze while I was in prison. I thought, well, what am I going to do with that? How's that going to apply on me here? It only really applied from when I was released. And so I wasn't sure. I remember when I was coming back from Belmarsh and my brother stopped to buy me a coffee. I said, well, you know, that might be a terrorist offence by you buying me a cup of coffee. So let's not do that. But it was to that level that we were simply unsure as to what can and can't be done. The day of Eid, I remember, came. I actually couldn't buy my kids any presents because it would constitute a criminal offence if I did. And essentially that, the closure of the accounts, the freezing of the accounts, the cage, who still are suffering as a result of that, it means that essentially that if you can't have accounts, bank accounts, that means you've got to deal in cash, which I thought would have been counterproductive, because if we've got tens of thousands of pounds coming in cash and that's what we're dealing with, you wouldn't be able to trace it or track it. But it's this ludicrous, again, way of why did this designation happen? It happened because I was charged, one of the charges against me was for the commission and funding of terrorism. In that, I provided a generator to one of the Syrian rebels. Therefore, as a result of that, I was put under a terrorist asset freeze.
Now, you just talked about how you couldn't buy presents for Eid. How did your family manage? I mean, how did they eat? How did they buy food? I mean, I'm going to assume that the asset freezing wasn't necessarily for your children and your wife as well, but that must have made it almost impossible for them to function. Did they have to survive on charitable donations?
Well, organisations like Hugs, Helping Households Under Great Stress, came to the aid of our family, as they have done to many people suffering in such circumstances. They weren't directly affected by the asset freeze as long as I was in prison. It's when I'm out of prison that they're affected by it. But nonetheless, accounts were closed down and all sorts of pressure was put on. The police had damaged our house and they'd thrown my family out the home for about almost 2 weeks when they were trashing the entire place. And my family was distributed between 4 different premises so it was, it's destructive on them. But one thing it did do to my children that it never did before, when I do talks and lectures around about Guantanamo and so forth, they've all heard it before, they're tired of it. This time round, it's personal. This time round, they've been politicized. This time round, they have seen for themselves and remember when I was kidnapped in Pakistan by American and Pakistani intelligence agents, they were too young to remember. Now they're teenagers, they remember very well. They're studying these things in university and college, and people ask them about what happened to your father. And I don't have to tell them anything. They saw what happened, and they were very much politicized as a result.
Does being politicized mean radicalized?
I don't. If it does, then that means we've all had it, because our politicians are all politicized, aren't they?
Now I'm aware that you had your passport confiscated at the end of last year. Has that now been returned? And are you free to travel without restriction and interference?
My passport was taken away from me in December after I'd come back, ironically, from South Africa just after Mandela had died. And I'd given a talk, first time I'd ever given a talk in a prison, in the Pollsmoor prison where Mandela was sent to after Robben Island. So immediately after the return from there, my passport was taken away. I've not had it returned. I've applied to get it back. So let's watch this space.
I understand that Craig Murray, a former ambassador himself, openly has stated that your arrest was at the behest directly of Theresa May. What did you make of that suggestion?
Yes, I've seen this statement by Craig Murray, who says that he believes from sources within that were close to him from the Foreign Office, and of course that he used to be part of, that my arrest was at the behest of directly Theresa May. Now, I don't know. I have never had any communications or dealings with her other than the fact that she's ordered my passport to be taken away from me. But generally, I think she must have seen me as she sees many people in the Muslim community, and that is that they should not be allowed to speak up. They should not be allowed to point out what the British government has been doing with other despotic regimes, and should not be allowed to ask for accountability, because if it's the MP's expenses that got everybody riled up, then what about people's lives, the lives of people who have been rendered and have been tortured and have been droned at the behest or with the complicity of the British government?
Now, in a recent Conservative Party conference speech, Theresa May talked about those individuals and organisations who operate just inside the law. It seems to be a theme that's going to be the major plank of the new legislation proposed. Are you concerned that there will be more pursuing of you on an individual basis and also Cage as an organisation?
Well, I don't think that we're just under the law at all. I think we're well above the law. But the problem is that the law keeps changing its goals. Its goalposts keep getting widened. So we see that new laws are being passed as we speak continuously. So, and there's proposals again to have new ones in relation to Syria. And then if that wasn't enough, then there's the new interpretation of what those laws are. So that for a period of time, for example, in the case of Syria, up until after Cameron was defeated in the House of Commons in trying to get airstrikes on Syria, only then did the first Syria-related arrests take place. Before that, there wasn't even one. So it shows that even though we have the laws in place, the application of them has to do with a completely political appetite of whether they want to pursue this or not.
Mosen Beg, it's as always been a huge pleasure and an honour to speak with you. Thank you very much for joining us on Islam Channel.
You're welcome, thank you.